Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, here with Sam, and today we're asking the annoying little question behind algorithmic taste. Why does your feed feel made for you while somehow making everyone look a little more alike?
Because the machine keeps learning from what people watch, like, finish, and skip, then feeds that back into the next round. That's a very polite way of saying your habits help decide what everybody else gets served.
Yeah, and that's exactly the tension worth sitting with. So let's start with the basic claim. Recommendation systems can feel like personal taste engines and still quietly push culture toward the same few outcomes. Sam, start us off.
I think the basic annoyance here is simple. Everything gets sold like it was hand-picked for your exact little brain, and then somehow everybody ends up circling the same handful of things. It makes culture feel personal on the surface and oddly similar underneath.
That's the clean version. The annoying part is that both pieces can be true at once. It can feel personal because the system learns your habits, and it can still push a lot of people toward the same visible stuff because everyone is reacting to similar incentives.
So the next question is not just, is this feed bad? It's whether recommendation systems are quietly changing what culture turns into over time. Because if everybody gets a different looking home screen but keeps running into the same outputs, that matters.
Yeah, that's the actual issue. We're not just talking about annoyance or bad taste. We're talking about what happens when the thing choosing your next song, clip, article, or product is constantly steering attention in one direction and then measuring what people do with that attention.
And people don't even experience that as being told what to like. They experience it as, wow, this app knows me, which is a flattering way to say, I clicked 3 things and now it won't leave me alone.
That's a good distinction. The system doesn't need to feel coercive to still narrow the range of what gets seen, repeated, and rewarded. A lot of this works through convenience and habit, not some dramatic mind control fantasy.
Right. And the weird part is how ordinary it is. You open a playlist and it feels like it was built around your mood, but the same handful of songs keep showing up across everybody's versions of that mood. Or you browse one thing on a storefront and suddenly the whole page acts like that is now your permanent personality.
Exactly. And that is why I wouldn't frame it as one hidden hand deciding culture for everyone. It is more like a system where lots of small choices line up. What gets clicked, what gets boosted, what gets copied, what gets surfaced early, and what gets pushed out of view.
Okay, but am I overstating it if I say that makes taste feel fake? Not fake in the sense that nobody likes anything, fake in the sense that the system is constantly massaging what counts as a choice.
That's fair as a suspicion, not as a verdict. The stronger claim is not that people don't have real preferences. It's that preferences get nudged, amplified, and repeated so often that what feels organic can end up partly shaped by the path you were shown first.
Which is annoying because it means the story is not just people are sheep. It's that people are normal. And normal people take the thing in front of them, especially when it looks like it was made for them and saves them effort.
That's the part I would keep. People are not infinitely curious machines. They follow friction. If one feed makes the easiest path also look like the most personal path, then the design is doing more work than it admits.
And that is where the suspicion gets a little sharper, because it is not only about taste, it's about exposure. If the same few things get boosted everywhere, then the menu starts shrinking before anyone even thinks they are making a decision.
Yes, and that is the useful distinction. Exposure is not the same thing as preference, but exposure shapes preference over time. If you keep putting the same lanes in front of people, you shouldn't be shocked when traffic starts looking more similar.
So the opening claim is basically this. recommendation systems don't just reflect taste, they shape the menu of taste in ways that can make everybody feel special while also nudging them toward the same narrow set of options. That is the suspicion we should actually test.
And before we get too dramatic about it, the next job is to define what those systems are actually doing and what part of this effect is real structure versus just people getting used to convenient shortcuts.
Okay, before we keep yelling at the vibes, we should slow down and say what the boring machine actually does. Because people talk about the algorithm like it's one haunted box in the basement, and that already gives it too much personality.
That's the first cleanup. In this conversation, a recommendation system is basically something that decides what to show you next, or what to rank higher, using signals about you, the content, and how people like you have behaved before. Not magic, just a sorting and guessing problem.
So it's less secret puppet master and more fancy sorter. Which is less dramatic, but somehow not that comforting once you remember a fancy sorter can still push millions of people toward the same handful of songs, clips, and takes.
Right, and the next step is not to mash every version of that thing into one blob. Personalization means the system adapts to your habits or preferences. Engagement optimization means it tries to keep you there longer. Diversity of exposure means it deliberately shows you more variety instead of just more of what already worked.
Hold on. Personalization and engagement are not the same thing, even though platforms love to make them sound like identical cousins.
They're related, but not the same. Personalization says, we think you'll prefer this based on what you've done before. Engagement says, we think this will hold your attention. Those can overlap, but they can also pull in different directions.
Okay, but when you say personalized, do you mean it knows my taste or just that it knows my behavior? Because those are very different claims, and one of them sounds a lot more flattering than the other.
That's exactly the distinction. It usually knows patterns in your behavior, not some deep private truth about your soul. If you keep pausing on one kind of clip or skipping another, the system can learn that pattern fast enough to shape what you see next, without understanding why you like it.
And that's where the suspicion gets fair, because what you like and what keeps you scrolling overlap just enough to sound harmless and just enough to be a problem. If the system learns that outrage, repetition, or low-effort novelty keeps you parked there, it doesn't need a theory of your personality to still steer the feed.
Exactly, and that's why I don't want to oversell intent. The system does not need to be trying to corrupt culture in some cartoon villain way. It just needs to reward the things people reliably react to. And then the output starts getting narrower because the same signals keep winning over and over.
So the fair version is not the machine has opinions. It's more like the ranking rules create habits, and habits can make a lot of different people end up seeing the same shaped stuff, even if they arrived there from different starting points.
Yes, and that lets us talk about the broader bucket without pretending every platform works the same way. Recommendation can include ranking, curation, search-adjacent suggestions, and trending surfaces, but in this episode, we mostly mean the systems that infer what to put in front of you next.
Which is useful, because curation and search are a little more obvious about what they are. Search says, you asked for this. Trending says, a bunch of people clicked this. Recommendation is the slippery one, because it can feel like the platform just noticed your taste and handed it back to you in a cleaner font.
That's a good way to put it, as long as we don't turn that into proof of anything sinister by itself. A system can feel personal because it is responding to your behavior, and it can still be flattening the range of things you encounter if the optimization keeps circling the same reliable responses.
So the question underneath all this is not whether recommendation is real. It obviously is. The question is whether it makes culture feel more tailored while quietly shrinking the menu everyone gets to pick from.
That's the real tension, yeah. If we keep the terms clean, then the next argument is about when personalization is genuinely useful and when it's just engagement wearing a friendlier name.
Okay, so the weird part isn't just that the feed learns what you clicked. It's that it starts to feel like it knows what you like before you've even decided you like it. That's where people get suspicious, because the experience stops feeling like discovery and starts feeling a little managed.
That's the right place to start. The suspicion isn't crazy because the experience is lopsided. You show a little interest, and then suddenly, the system keeps handing you versions of the same thing until it feels like taste. Not proof of mind control, obviously. Just a very efficient way to narrow the menu. But what part of that complaint do you think is the fair part, and what part starts drifting into overreach?
The fair part is that people are not imagining the pressure. You click one thing, and pretty quickly, the system starts acting like that one thing was a confession. Now your feed is full of clones of the same clip, the same angle, the same joke structure, the same 5 seconds of dopamine bait.
Right, and that can make people feel like their taste was revealed rather than shaped. The technical choice is still there. You can scroll, skip, and ignore it. But the environment keeps steering hard enough that the steering disappears into the background.
And that's what bugs people. It doesn't always feel like being sold to. It feels like being guided into a room and told you came there yourself. By the time you notice, you're already looking at the same handful of options again and again.
Yeah, and that's why the suspicion lands. Repeated exposure changes what feels familiar, and familiar starts to feel correct. Then people read the pattern backward and say, see, this must just be what everyone likes. When really, a lot of what they liked was what got repeated in front of them.
Exactly. Recognition gets mistaken for preference all the time. If I see the same style of video 12 times in a day, by the end of the day, I don't just know it, I start to think I like it, or at least that I'm supposed to. Platforms absolutely cash in on that confusion.
And that confusion is useful to the platform because it makes the feed feel personal without necessarily making it broad. It can keep learning the narrow version of you, the version most likely to click, and then keep flattering that version until it looks like your whole personality.
That's the part that feels off. Not the internet is evil, just why does everything keep converging on the same formats, the same takes, the same little emotional hooks? People start feeling like they're being cultured instead of addressed.
And once enough people have that experience, they start assuming the pattern is just human nature. Maybe some of it is, but some of it is selection pressure. The stuff that performs gets copied. The copied stuff gets rewarded. And the rewarded stuff becomes the default look of the feed.
So the suspicious version is not that there's some secret coordination. It's that the system can flatten culture without anybody needing to sit around and plan it out. Incentives, repetition, and a lot of people mistaking familiarity for preference does the job just fine.
Yeah, that's the honest version. The feed can feel personal while pushing a lot of people toward the same lanes. That's why the question keeps hanging around. Individualized on the surface, standardized underneath. It doesn't have to be a grand scheme to still be a little unsettling.
Okay, before we get fancy, the bad first answer is that recommendation systems are either pure personalization or pure manipulation. Either they know your soul better than you do, or there's some evil little machine turning everybody into the same beige sludge. Both versions are too neat, which is usually how you know they're wrong.
That neatness is the giveaway. People reach for those stories because they save work. One makes the system sound like it just hands you exactly what you wanted, and the other makes it sound like there's only one big hidden force behind everything.
And the second one is always a little too theatrical, which is how you know it's become internet language instead of analysis.
Yeah, that's the bumper sticker version. The real answer is less dramatic and more annoying. It can be useful, it can save time, and it can still shape what feels normal by repetition and ranking. Convenience is not neutrality.
That's the part people hate hearing. They want either a clean compliment or a clean accusation. If they like what they got served, they call it taste. If they don't like it, they call it manipulation. Same machine, different mood.
And the point is that both reactions can be incomplete. The system is doing more than reflecting a preference that already existed. It's deciding what gets shown first, what gets repeated, what looks common, and what gets quietly pushed to the side. None of that proves bad intent on its own. But it does mean the menu is already narrowed before the user even feels like they're choosing.
So the false split is basically either you picked it freely or the system did everything. Real life is messier, which is inconvenient because messier answers are harder to sell. Nobody puts partly shaped by ranking and partly by habit in a dramatic thread and gets applause for it.
No, because that sounds like an honest answer instead of a hot take. But it's the useful one. The system isn't reaching into your skull and rewriting your opinions. It's shaping the environment around your attention. And that still changes what you end up watching, sharing, and thinking is worth your time.
Joe, am I overstating the manipulation part if I say people start to confuse what gets served with what they actually like? Because that feels like the real trick. Repetition starts looking like preference, and then everybody acts like the preference was always there.
That's the cleaner version of the complaint. I wouldn't call it brainwashing because that word does too much work and lets people stop thinking. But yes, repeated exposure, easy access, and social reinforcement can make a narrow set of options feel natural. Not false, just more settled, more familiar, more likely to win again.
And that's where the lazy defense gets annoying. People hear, you like what you picked, and treat that like the whole story. Ugh, but the order matters. The defaults matter. What gets surfaced first matters. That's not proof of a conspiracy. It's just how attention gets steered without anyone having to announce they're steering it.
Right, and this is where the real distinction lives. There's a difference between saying the system is fake and saying the system is influential. Those are not the same claim. One is a moral panic. The other is just paying attention to how people actually use whatever is easiest to reach.
So if somebody says, it's all just your personal taste, that's too clean. And if somebody says, the algorithm made everybody the same, that's also too clean. The sharper version is that convenience shapes habit. Habit shapes taste. And taste then gets presented back to you like it was untouched the whole time.
Exactly. The system can be genuinely helpful and still narrow the field in ways people barely notice. That's the part worth sitting with. Because once you see it, a lot of the argument becomes less mystical and more mechanical. Okay, but before we keep treating this like some mysterious force, the basic thing to notice is pretty ordinary. Recommendation systems learn from what people actually do. They do not just guess your soul. They watch behavior and adjust.
So it's not mind reading, it's bookkeeping with a little anxiety.
That is the clean version. On a basic level, platforms use signals like watch history, likes, dislikes, ratings, search history, subscriptions, how long you watched something, and even the little not interested or don't recommend buttons. The system is getting clues from every one of those moves.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the whole thing is basically a very fast, bad listener? It hears one thing you said once and starts building a personality chart.
Not a bad listener, just literal. If you keep pausing on one kind of thing, clicking similar stuff, or watching longer than usual, it starts to infer that's a lane you actually want. And because it keeps updating, it can react pretty quickly to recent behavior instead of some older version of you.
So I watch one video because I'm half asleep, and now I'm apparently being introduced to a new identity. That's the annoying part. It doesn't just record preference, it sometimes records accident.
Exactly. And the system usually doesn't know whether that click was deep interest, boredom, curiosity, or you just got distracted and let something run. It only knows that the signal existed. And repeated signals start to matter more than a one-off moment.
So the page can mistake a passing mood for a stable trait. That's already kind of a problem because people are messier than their clicks.
And platforms do know that behavior sits in context. Netflix, for example, has described recommendations using things like viewing history, ratings, similar members, title information, time of day, language, device, and how long a title was enjoyed. So the model isn't only reading the content, it's reading the conditions around the content too.
Okay, but that's still the personal level. I get why my page gets weird. Where does the sameness creep in? Because that's the part people feel, and then nobody wants to say out loud.
That is where the feedback loop idea matters. One paper on recommender systems describes a pretty simple cycle. Recommendations are consumed, reactions are logged, and the system is retrained on that feedback. Once that loop keeps running, popularity bias can get stronger, aggregate diversity can shrink, and taste can get represented in a narrower way over time.
So the thing people call my taste might be partly the machine repeatedly flattering the easiest version of it. Not fake exactly, just nudged.
That's the stronger version of the claim. It does not require a conscious plan to flatten culture. No one has to sit in a room saying, let's make everyone the same. If enough people respond to familiar stuff, the system gets more confident serving familiar stuff. And that can make the experience more similar across users.
And once the familiar stuff is what keeps winning, the weird stuff has to fight uphill just to get seen. Is that the fair version, or am I making it sound more sinister than it is?
That's fair. I would put it less as sinister and more as self-reinforcing. The system is not declaring war on variety, but it is learning from what already won attention. And that naturally gives more weight to the obvious, the familiar, and the stuff that already knows how to perform in public.
Right, so the machine learns the safest thing, and then everybody calls that taste. That is bleak in a very boring way.
Boring, but useful. And once you see that pattern, the next question is not whether the system is magical, it's who gets rewarded when the safest thing keeps winning, and why that loop is so hard to break.
Okay, so now that we've got the mechanics on the table, the bigger question is who actually benefits from keeping the whole thing pointed at engagement? Because if the system is always being nudged toward the easiest attention grab, that tells you a lot about what it values and who gets protected by that setup.
Mostly the platform, but not only the platform. Higher engagement helps the service because it keeps people around longer, it helps creators who can hold attention, And it helps advertisers because they're buying time in front of eyeballs that are still there. So you end up with a pretty broad little ecosystem where the same metric is paying a bunch of different bills.
Which is the part that always feels a little too tidy to me. Nobody has to say out loud, let's flatten culture. They just have to keep rewarding the stuff that travels well, lands fast, and doesn't make anybody work very hard to keep watching.
To keep watching with less friction.
Right, and less friction is doing a lot of work there. If the system can keep people watching with recognizable patterns, it does not have to gamble on weirder stuff that might be genuinely good, but takes longer to click into, explain, or trust. That starts sounding less like what people want in some broad cultural sense and more like what is easiest to score.
That's the useful distinction. YouTube, for example, says its recommendation system is built to match viewers with content they're likely to watch and enjoy, using engagement and satisfaction signals. So the public version of the rule is not be culturally adventurous. It's basically find the next thing this person is likely to stay with when they show up.
So am I overstating it if I say the safest bet is usually recognizability? Like the thing that already worked gets another shot because it is easier to predict, easier to defend, and easier for the system to be right about. That seems like the kind of logic that makes the same shapes keep coming back.
No, that's basically the boring truth. Large-scale recommender systems often train on engagement because it is abundant immediate feedback. And the RecSys point is that popularity bias can make already popular items show up even more. Once something has a track record, it gets learned better, recommended more, and then it has another chance to look like proof that it was the right choice in the first place.
So the weird part is that you do not need a mastermind at all. If the scoring rule rewards what keeps attention fastest, then creators learn to make repeatable shapes. The platform gets cleaner prediction, and the whole thing starts leaning into whatever is easiest to recognize at speed. That is a much more boring explanation than a grand plan, which is exactly why it makes sense.
And it helps explain why better for the user and better for the platform can drift apart without anyone declaring war on originality. In the short term, the user may get something familiar, the creator may get distribution, and the platform gets a cleaner signal. But over time, that same loop keeps making familiar things easier to justify than genuinely broad discovery. Because the system can point to engagement and say, see, this worked.
Okay, but where would you draw the line between people naturally like familiar stuff and the system keeps selecting familiar stuff because it is safer? Because those are not the same claim, and I do not want to pretend they are.
The line is that people absolutely do like patterns they already understand, but platforms can turn that into a feedback loop. The system is not inventing taste out of thin air. It is amplifying the parts of taste that are easiest to measure, easiest to repeat, and easiest to monetize. That is how you get feeds that feel personal on the surface, while the underlying behavior keeps converging on the same few shapes.
Okay, but once the incentives are clear, the internet part is where this gets ugly. Before, a weird taste could stay weird in one town or one friend group. Now the same thing can get thrown into everybody's face until it starts feeling normal by force.
That's the right place to go. The internet doesn't just widen the menu, it changes how often the menu gets repeated. And repetition is how a lot of culture starts feeling standard instead of niche.
And the annoying part is that visibility can fake universality. You see one style all day because the platform keeps handing it back to you, and suddenly it feels like everyone likes it, when really you're just inside a very noisy hallway.
Exactly. And the recommender systems are not reading minds in some mystical way. They're taking signals from context, from what you watched before, and even from time of day or device type. So the same person can get a different feed in a different moment, which makes each moment feel more universal than it is.
So the feed is basically a machine for turning coincidence into a fake consensus. You clicked 3 cooking clips on a Sunday afternoon, and now the internet is telling you, very seriously, that everyone has become a sourdough minimalist with great lighting.
That's funny, but it's also the useful version of the point. The system isn't saying, here's the truth about culture. It's saying, here is what keeps people watching right now. And if enough people get routed through that logic, you start seeing feedback loops that can reduce overall diversity and make the experience more similar over time.
And then influencers show up and do the second round of damage. They don't always invent the thing. They package it in a shape that is easy to copy, which is how a niche idea turns into 20 identical posts with different fonts.
Right, the format spreads faster than the original thought. One clip, one sound, one caption style, and suddenly everybody is using the same skeleton for completely different ideas. The content can even change, but the structure stays the same.
Which is why everything starts feeling like a remix of a remix of a remix. Not because one shadowy thing is coordinating it, but because the safest move is to copy what already got attention instead of taking a real swing.
And that safety has a cost. If creators are rewarded for recognizable shapes, they trim away whatever is weird, slow, or hard to describe, because those parts don't travel as easily. Over time, you don't just get more content. You get more content that has been pre-decided by what the platform can easily amplify.
So am I overstating it if I say the internet doesn't create sameness from scratch, but it puts a turbocharger on the same old pressure to conform?
No, that's the clean version. The internet doesn't invent the human urge to copy status, but it speeds up the copy-paste cycle, makes the winners more visible, and lets a tiny trend feel bigger and more inevitable than it really is.
And because it's all happening in public, everybody can see the trend while it's still forming, which makes people pile on even faster. Nobody wants to be the only person not understanding the joke or the only person missing the format.
That publicness matters. When everyone can see what gets rewarded, the pattern becomes teachable, which means more people can reproduce it with less effort. That's how the platform environment amplifies the same pressure across a lot of users at once. Not by mind control, just by making repetition easy and visibility brutal.
So it's not that the internet invents fake taste out of nowhere. It makes the imitation loop faster, louder, and a lot harder to ignore, which is how niche stuff starts to feel weirdly mass-produced before anyone has even admitted that's what happened.
Yeah, and that is the part people miss when they say, well, it's just more choice. More choice on paper can still mean less real variety in practice if the same few shapes keep getting surfaced, copied, and rewarded.
So the next question is whether that sameness is mostly a platform problem or a people problem, because I don't think you can blame one without admitting the other is making the first one work.
That's exactly where it gets interesting. The platform turns the dial up, but it only works because people like recognition, copy what looks successful, and don't want to be left behind when a format starts moving.
Okay, so if we're being fair, this is where the argument splits into 2 sane readings instead of one dumb internet fight. One reading says recommendation systems actually help people find the weird little corners they'd never stumble into on their own. The other says they take that same weirdness, sort it by performance, and quietly make everybody's cultural life look more similar than it used to. Those are both real readings, which is annoying because it means neither side gets to just be smug and done.
That's the clean split. And the important part is that both can be true without either one being a cartoon villain. If you only say, the system is amazing, you miss the pressure it creates. If you only say, the system is flattening everything, you miss the people who genuinely found better stuff through it. Those are not the same claim. Even if people keep smashing them together, like that makes the argument simpler.
Yeah, and the optimistic version is not fake. For a lot of people, the feed really does act like a scout that goes places they would never bother going themselves. You click on one odd thing, and suddenly you're in a niche that feels weirdly specific in a good way. If you're into obscure music, a weird hobby, or just one very particular kind of stupid, the machine can be better at finding the next thing than your own patience is.
I buy that, and I think that's the strongest version of the pro system case. The better claim is not that it invents your taste out of thin air, but that it helps you discover parts of it you didn't know how to reach. That matters. A lot of people are not curating some noble manual museum of selfhood. They're just bumping around until something lands. And the tool can absolutely help with that.
And that's why people defend it so hard. They're not defending an abstract system. They're defending the memory of the first time it nailed something for them. The first playlist that felt creepy accurate. The first creator who seemed to read their mind. The first niche that made them feel like, okay, there are other weirdos here. That's a real emotional win. And I don't want to dismiss it just because the incentives are messy.
Right, and that emotional win is part of why the skeptical version has to be more careful than just, it's all fake. The complaint is subtler than that. A recommendation can be genuinely useful and still be part of a narrowing system. You can discover a better songwriter, a better recipe, a better obscure podcast, and still be moving through a path that rewards the same kind of structure over and over.
But here's the annoying part. Once it finds something that lands, it doesn't just say, cool, keep exploring. It starts learning what keeps you around, what makes you pause, what gets the easiest reaction. And that can still feel like discovery while also being a funnel. Joe, am I overstating the flattening there?
No, that's the fair concern. The skeptical version doesn't need a secret master plan. It just needs a system that keeps rewarding what performs best and keeps repeating the pattern. Over time, that can make culture feel more individualized at the surface and more standardized in the path underneath. People think they're roaming freely, but a lot of them are choosing between versions of the same high-performing shape. The platform doesn't have to ban niche stuff to compress culture. It just has to keep rewarding what performs.
And then everybody calls that tastes like it arrived from heaven. That's the part that bugs me. The thing still feels personal, which is why people trust it. But the menu starts getting shaped before you notice you're choosing from one. It's not that the recommendation is always wrong. It's that the options start arriving pre-sorted in a way that feels invisible while it's happening.
Exactly. And that is why the two readings can sit on top of each other instead of canceling each other out. The system can be useful in the discovery phase and then become a narrowing force in the repeat phase. So the honest version is not, it ruins taste. And it's not, it perfectly serves taste. It learns fast enough to feel magical and dumb enough to overserve whatever already works.
So the clean takeaway is that personalization is real, but uniqueness is often the sales pitch sitting on top of it. People absolutely can find stranger, better, more specific stuff through these systems. I just don't think that means the systems are neutral about what kinds of taste get repeated, rewarded, and made legible to everyone else. If anything, that's the part people don't feel until later. Okay, the lazy version of this argument is that Personalized and homogenized are opposites. If something is tailored to you, people act like it has to be wildly different from what everyone else gets, which is a very cute thing to say while you're staring at the same 5 thumbnails.
That's the false split. A recommender can make your route feel specific while still shrinking the set of destinations. And there's even a term for part of that feedback loop: algorithmic confounding. The system learns from behavior that was already shaped by recommendations, so it keeps reinforcing its own past choices instead of starting fresh.
So am I overstating it if I say people confuse "I got different stuff" with "the culture stayed wide open"?
No, that's the cleaner version. The feed can be personalized in the order, timing, and packaging, while the pool of exposed content gets narrower over time. Recommender work keeps running into the accuracy versus diversity trade-off. If you keep optimizing for what looks immediately relevant, breadth tends to lose ground.
That is the annoying part, because people hear personalized and assume more freedom, when half the time it just means the system got better at hurting you without making it obvious. The menu feels custom, but the menu board got smaller.
And to be fair, the goal is not always to make everything samey. Some systems try to balance novelty and usefulness with hybrid methods or broader ranking rules, but that balance is never free. Push harder on one side, and you usually pay on the other.
So the mistake is treating this like either total uniqueness or total sameness, when the real setup is messier. You can have a feed that feels like it knows you personally and still nudge a lot of people toward the same handful of formats, moods, and creators.
That's the better frame. Personalization often lives in the routing, not the destination. The steps get tuned to you, while the available exits get fewer. It's not that every user ends up with identical taste. It's that the system can compress the range of what feels worth paying attention to.
And that's why the lazy debate keeps missing the point. People want one clean slogan. Either "the internet made taste infinite" or "the internet made everyone the same." But the actual answer is uglier and more useful than that.
Right. The platform doesn't have to force sameness. It just has to reward certain paths again and again until they start feeling like preference. That's how a personalized experience can still produce a narrower culture without anybody sitting there twirling a mustache.
That's the part people miss when they talk about the surface level, too. 2 users can get different packaging, different entry points, and different little hooks and still end up in a very similar neighborhood of content. Is that why the argument gets so sloppy so fast?
I think so. The front end looks varied, so people assume the whole structure must be varied. But the deeper question is, what keeps getting surfaced, rewarded, and repeated? If one person comes in through comedy and another through productivity clips, that doesn't matter much if both keep getting nudged toward the same narrow set of things that hold attention.
So the difference is real at the start, but it doesn't guarantee a wide result. You can absolutely have different packaging and still end up feeding everyone from the same smaller pantry of content.
That's the useful distinction. Variety at the doorway is not the same thing as variety in the long run. Once the system learns which paths keep people engaged, it can keep trimming away the stuff that doesn't fit the model, even if the user never feels like they're being boxed in.
So the dumb take is nothing is personalized. The sharper take is that personalization can be very real and still lead people toward a smaller set of outcomes.
Exactly. Custom path, smaller outcome set. That is the sentence people keep trying to dodge because it doesn't sound dramatic enough. But it's the honest version of what the system is doing.
Okay, but after all the platform talk, there's the rude question. Are we helping build the thing we complain about? Because a lot of the sameness isn't some spooky force from above. It's people clicking, finishing, replaying, saving, and then acting shocked when the next 5 recommendations look a lot like the last 5.
That's the cleaner version of the accusation. YouTube says recommendations use watch history, search history, subscriptions, likes, dislikes, not interested feedback, don't recommend channel selections, and even satisfaction surveys. Netflix says it keeps updating from every visit too, what people start watching, what they finish, and how they rate it. So, the system is learning from behavior, not from a speech people give about their taste.
Joe, am I overstating the user part, or is that basically the uncomfortable point? Because if the machine learns from what we do, then the whole "I hate my feed" complaint can give a little theatrical. Not always fake, just a bit too clean for how messy the actual behavior is.
It can be theatrical, but I wouldn't make it a moral indictment. Convenience is doing a lot of work here. If the app gives you the same kind of hit with one tap, and you're tired, bored, or half checking your phone between other things, most people are not staging a rebellion against their own habits. They're just taking the easy option.
That's why the self-defense never lands. People say they want variety, but then they reward the same format, the same pacing, the same face, the same emotional temperature. It's like claiming you're hungry for dinner while ordering the same snack every night and acting offended when the pantry keeps stocking snacks.
And this is where the annoying part gets real, because the complaint and the behavior can both be sincere. People can genuinely be tired of the pattern and still keep reinforcing it because boredom loses to habit, stress, familiarity, or simple friction. So yes, users help train the system, not because they're evil, but because they are predictable, and the environment keeps nudging them toward whatever is easiest to keep doing.
Because they're human, yeah. Which is almost worse, honestly, because it means the feed doesn't need mind control. It just needs us to be tired and lazy and a little too happy to stay where we already were.
Mostly, yes. But I want to keep the scale straight. One person's click doesn't rewrite culture, and it's too easy to turn this into a fake guilt speech. The real story is aggregate behavior. Millions of slightly shaped choices, plus an interface designed to make those choices easy, produce a very narrow-looking world over time.
Right. So the fair version isn't users are to blame, and it isn't users are innocent. It's that the audience is part of the feedback loop. We are not just being served taste, we're teaching taste back to the system every time we linger, skip, repeat, or share, and then acting like we had nothing to do with the result.
That's the honest takeaway. The system isn't innocent, and the audience isn't helpless. The uglier truth is that people often help maintain the sameness they claim to hate, but they do it inside a setup that rewards fast, low-friction repetition. So the problem is shared, which is annoying, but it's also the only version that actually explains why the feed feels personal and mass-produced at the same time.
Do you think the sharper version is that people are choosing what feels familiar and then calling it taste? Because that seems closer to what happens than this fantasy where everyone is making pristine, fully informed decisions about culture at 11:30 p.m. with one eye closed.
Yeah, that's closer. It's not that people have no taste. It's that taste gets trained by repetition, ease, and whatever feels least effortful in the moment. The platform doesn't have to bully anybody. It just has to notice what gets rewarded and keep making that path smoother than the others.
So the ugly middle is that We really do influence what comes back to us, but we influence it inside a system that keeps narrowing the menu of what feels worth clicking. That's why the same people can say, honestly, that they chose it and still end up in a feed that feels weirdly pre-decided.
Exactly. Shared responsibility doesn't mean equal responsibility, and it definitely doesn't mean the platforms get off the hook. It just means the loop works because the user side is active too. That makes the answer less comfortable, but also more believable than pretending the machine is doing everything by itself.
So I think we can finally say the annoying clean version: recommendation systems do make taste feel personal, but they're doing it inside a pretty narrow box. They learn what you already respond to, then serve you more of the same with just enough variation to keep you clicking. That's the part that feels like magic, and also the part that quietly flattens everything.
That's the useful answer. It's not that people become identical overnight, and it's not that every feed is the same sludge machine either. It's that the system rewards recognizable patterns. So you get personalization that often means slightly different packaging around familiar stuff. The menu can look huge, but the choices it keeps putting in front of you are not infinite.
Right, and that's why the whole thing can be true from both sides. A person opens their feed and thinks, wow, this knows me, while the bigger cultural effect is, wow, a lot of us are being pushed toward the same handful of formats. It's not a fake feeling, it's just a feeling built out of incentives, not destiny.
Exactly. The platform is not reading anyone's soul. It is responding to behavior. And behavior is shaped by what gets rewarded. So the feed can feel intimate without being deep. And culturally, it can become repetitive without anyone sitting there saying, let's make everybody the same. That part matters because it keeps us honest about intent.
So the strongest version of the suspicious take is not the algorithm is evil. It's the business model and the design incentives are very good at narrowing what gets seen because narrow stuff is easier to predict, package, and sell. That's less dramatic than a conspiracy, but honestly more annoying because nobody has to be a cartoon villain for the result to be real.
And that's where I'd land too. The fair criticism is about structure, not secret intent. If a system makes you feel uniquely understood, while it keeps routing you through the same few emotional grooves, that's not proof of deception. It is a sign the incentives are doing their job. The user experience and the cultural outcome can point in different directions at the same time.
Okay, but where would you draw the line between this is just personalization and this is actually narrowing culture? Because I think that's the part people wave away too fast. If every recommendation just gives you more of what you already slightly liked, you're not discovering the world, you're touring a fenced-off version of it.
I'd draw it at repetition without surprise. Personalization is fine when it helps you find genuinely new things that fit your interests. It gets suspicious when the system keeps circling the same shapes because those shapes are safe bets for engagement. Then your feed starts to feel custom, but culturally it's recycling a smaller and smaller set of patterns.
And that probably changes how you use your own feed. If every scroll is just the same taste loop with a different jacket, the useful habit is to notice when the machine is confirming you instead of broadening you. Not because broadening is morally superior, just because it keeps the whole thing from turning into a mirror with better lighting.
That's the practical test, yeah. You do not need to become a contrarian or punish yourself with content you hate. But if you never see anything that surprises you in a good way, the system is probably optimizing for comfort faster than it is optimizing for discovery.
So the real tell is not, do I like this? It's, do I keep getting the same kind of like?
That's the clean version. If the feed keeps rewarding the same handful of reactions, it will feel tailor-made while quietly tightening the circle. So the final answer is not panic. It's just being awake to the trade-off.
Personalized on top, standardized underneath. That's the honest version, and it's enough to make you a little less impressed by the magic trick.
So that wraps this one up. Thanks for spending a few minutes with Say the Question. Follow along, and we'll be back tomorrow with another one.